Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Red Lettuce. Tonight, we have a very special guest. We have author, activist, and journalist Caleb Maupin. We are very excited to have you with us, Caleb. Tonight, we're going to talk about fascism, the incoming Biden and Harris administration, and what that looks like for the left. We're going to talk about the synthetic left, the Sino-Soviet split, nuclear energy, and Iran. But before we get into it, those that are watching, please make sure you like, share, and subscribe to help support the show. Caleb, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Sure, always a pleasure.
Yeah, so our first topic is we're going to be talking about fascism, because we see this, we see the word fascist and fascism thrown around quite a bit on the right with liberals and conservatives on the left. So what is the correct definition of fascism, and how many forms of fascism are there?
What fascism actually is that when capitalism enters a crisis, right? And this is the science of Marxism. Let's talk briefly about what a capitalist crisis is. Capitalism is a system where production is carried out to make profits, right? You know, that's why we have buildings. We don't have buildings because people need a place to live or a place to work. We have buildings because capitalists need to make profits, right? We don't have food so people can eat it. We have food so that that big box stores and big agribusiness companies can make profits. Profit defines production under capitalism. Well, under capitalism, when you have production for profit, you end up with a problem pretty quickly. It's a naturally unstable system because the worker cannot buy back the product that he produces, right? It is the worker that produces the product by selling their labor power. And it's also the worker who is the consumer. But the worker can never make enough money to buy back the product he creates. And as a result of that, you get systemic crises. You get the market being glutted with products that cannot be sold, especially when there are big leaps in technology, right? You tend to have big crises of capitalism in which profits are not being made by capitalists. Corporations are closing down. There's mass unemployment. The living standards are dropping. Protests are rising. Instability is rising in society. So when capitalism enters a crisis like that, you generally get two poles of society. You get one pole that says the way to get out of this is to move towards socialism, or to move in a more progressive direction, and to start controlling the economy, start developing science and industry, and start moving in a progressive direction. And then there's another pole that usually emerges that says the way to resolve the crisis is with destruction, right? Is with beating down sections of society, destroying them, building up the military, building up the prisons, and dropping living standards for one section of the population, engaging in mass repression, preparing for war. And that pole that wants to solve the crisis with destruction and repression, that pole is what you can call fascism.
Yeah, and you've also pointed out something interesting on your live streams before. You pointed out Silicon Valley fascism, and Silicon Valley is making up Joe Biden's cabinet. Making up. These are the people that Biden and Harris are surrounding themselves with. So why don't you let us know more about what that is exactly?
Well, Silicon Valley, you talk about the computer revolution, right? And we're really talking in the 70s and 80s. There was a strategic decision made by American intelligence. They realized that the Soviet Union did not have the technology and the resources really to invest in its tech sector. So a way that the United States could beat the Soviet Union was by the United States being on the cutting edge of computer technology. And there was a treaty, let's not forget, that forbid the sale of high technology to any Soviet-aligned country. There was actually a NATO treaty that you could not sell a computer to the Soviet Union. You couldn't sell any product that had computer parts in it. They were basically blocked out of the tech revolution and the tech boom of the 70s and 80s. So at the same time, then you had the CIA and the NSA, providing the money to companies like IBM, to the forces that eventually moved in, to Apple and others, providing the money, arranging for a lot of loaning of money, government sponsorship to basically set up these huge tech corporations based in California with the idea that the United States could be the center of this new technological leap. And that's where Silicon Valley comes from. Now, at the same time that Silicon Valley was being intentionally set up by the government, there was a lot of ideology being pushed by the wing of the CIA based in Southern California, right? The CIA is a very big agency. There are different regions that have different perspectives. And Indiana tends to be the neoconservative wing of the CIA. That's where Pete Buttigieg comes out of, Amy Coney Barrett. That's more the Notre Dame University has been listed as a place that the CIA heavily recruits. That's the more neocon wing. But in terms of the liberal CIA, that's very much a Southern California-based entity. The Stanford Research Institute is a very, very important academic institution that does CIA research. In fact, that's where the CIA contracted a number of people to do research into, for example, telekinesis, right? You ever see the movie The Men Who Stare at Goats, right? There's whole programs where the CIA was investigating all kinds of strange, mystical, occult practices. People read about MK Ultra, which was the CIA's drug program, where they were distributing drugs around the country and seeing what would happen. And the California wing of the CIA, has a very different perspective than some other wings, right? It's very much considered to be more the new age, hippie, counterculture wing. There was a particular individual named Marilyn Ferguson, and she was the spiritual advisor to Al Gore. She was invited to the White House during the 1990s to hang out with Bill and Hillary Clinton and with Al Gore and give spiritual advice, claimed to, kind of be a psychic. Her name was Marilyn Ferguson. And she published a book in 1981, at the same time that that Silicon Valley was being set up. She published a book called The Aquarian Conspiracy. And this book was endorsed by all kinds of people. Carl Rogers, the leading, father of American therapy and psychology, who also started his career with the CIA's brainwashing programs. He endorsed the book, as did Buckminster Fuller, another CIA-linked intellectual, as did Arthur Kessler, who was known to write anti-communist screeds for the CIA. All these CIA-linked intellectuals endorsed this strange occult book that was published in the early 1980s by this woman who was very influential, not just with Al Gore, but a number of top Democrats took like spiritual advice from her. And if you read The Aquarian Conspiracy, what it basically argues is that below the surface, there is this movement of people, intellectuals, teachers, doctors, lawyers, all kinds of people that want to create a global explosion of unrest. All over the world, they want to create unrest. And the hope is that the human population can be drastically reduced so that humanity comes back into balance with Mother Nature. And to get to pre-Christian ideas, these pagan mystical ideas that were in Europe prior to the Roman Empire and the arrival of Christianity. And the way to do that, there's going to be this awakening all over the world, and it's not pro-communist and it's not anti-communist, but it's going to bring the world back into balance. It'll be like when in the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, when God tore the Tower of Babel down, the advances of human technology will be reversed and everything will go back into balance. And this is the book that's been published. And it's quite scary if you read it, right? It seems very optimistic and exciting. There's a section in it that describes almost a brainwashing process where a person is induced to have a breakdown with drugs or something like that. And then out of that breakdown, they're recruited to the Aquarian Conspiracy. It's quite bizarre stuff. And you would think this is just a fringe crazy book, but this is a very, very influential person and she lists as who's working with her all the same think tanks that are involved in setting up Silicon Valley, such as the Stanford Research Institute, the Studies of Democratic Societies Institute, something like that. I mean, they're all involved, right? And so this is kind of the perspective that informs a lot of the liberal elements that were involved in strategically building Silicon Valley. Now, when it comes to the ideology of people in Silicon Valley, Malthusianism, the belief that there are too many people in the world, right? And that this is the problem and that we need to reduce the human population. That's very big. That's very, very big among the tech giants, the folks at Google, the folks at Facebook, the folks at Twitter. A lot of them really, really do think there are too many people in the world. Eco-Malthusianism, they call it. Plus, On top of that, there is also the libertarian perspective, right? The belief that might is right, and that the strongest survive, that compassion is weakness. The writings of Ayn Rand, the conservative philosopher, I mean, she's very popular among the Silicon Valley folks. What's interesting is the Wall Street Journal actually composed a very, very big article by Trump supporters criticizing Silicon Valley and basically alleging that the Silicon Valley folks, that they don't have any loyalty to the United States in particular. They are so individualistic, and they so much believe that they are superior, that they have achieved their wealth and their high status simply through their own genius and all of that. They have really no loyalty to the United States. And it's almost like the difference between the Silicon Valley faction and the Trump faction is that Trump wants free markets and deregulation in the United States, but he also wants tariffs, and he doesn't care about the rest of the world, America first. These people want a global free market explosion, a global free market revolution, to privatize things, to unleash chaos so that the world goes back into balance, so they themselves, they consider themselves to be the natural leaders, the natural superior ones can rule, the inferior rabble can depopulate, and the free market can do its magic all over the world, the glorification of the individual. This is some scary ideology that Silicon Valley believes. Now, they tend to be more socially liberal, right? You get a lot more support for LGBT rights on Silicon Valley. You get a lot more like blatant opposition to racism and sexism. That's a good thing, right? I'm certainly, I'm not opposed to that kind of thing. But I think people should be aware of what the agenda is. And during the Hillary Clinton years, when Hillary Clinton was running the State Department, Silicon Valley played a very key role in manipulating the outcome of the Arab Spring. Jared Andrew Cohen, who was from Google Alphabet and was with the Council on Foreign Relations and then working in the Hillary Clinton State Department, he was doing things that the Obama administration didn't even know about. He was going to Twitter on behalf of the State Department and telling them to do things related to Twitter's activities in Iran without telling Obama. And Obama heard about this, tried to fire him. Hillary Clinton protected him. And that Silicon Valley and the Hillary Clinton State Department coordinated. Really what they want is they want a global explosion of chaos and violence to secure the rule of global monopoly capitalism. That's what they want. They are very much revolutionaries in the sense that they want unrest to be fomented for the purpose of establishing what Anne Marie Slaughter, who is another intellectual very much associated with the Hillary Clinton State Department, what she calls the open international system. They want to create a global free trade system. No borders, no tariffs, no labor unions, no strong lefty or socialist governments to get in their way, the unrestrained rule of multinational corporations through fomenting chaos around the world. And that is a destructive and fascistic view. I mean, it's different than the Trump view, which also has fascistic elements to it, no doubt. But the reason I use the term Silicon Valley fascist, I'm referring to this particular current, right? I mean, you can see themes there that remind you of the Nazis, right? With the occult theme, the Malthusian themes, there's a fascistic element to what they're about, just like there's a fascistic element to what Trump is about.
Yeah. Wow, I'm a little speechless. Let's build on some economic stuff. Can you tell us maybe a little bit about Nazi economics? Because you did mention the occult, and that made me immediately think about Nazi economics and their like fringe pagan stuff. The whole blood and soil thing, the neo-fascist nonsense. What are Nazi economics, and how is the American ruling class using it to stabilize capitalism?
Well, it's very interesting because nobody really knows anything about Nazi Germany and how it actually worked. People know about the horrors of the Holocaust and the Second World War. People know about how Hitler came to power, but often, what the Nazis actually did is kind of glossed over. And the best book that I've ever read in order to understand it is a book called Hitler's Banker. And it's a biography of the economist of Nazi Germany, whose name was Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht. And he was a German banker from a wealthy family. He's the one who convinced the German ruling class that Hitler was their guy, right? That Hitler had been around for a decade, running the Nazi party, fighting in the streets with the communists. But it wasn't until Hjalmar Schacht It wasn't until he basically went around to all the ruling families and industrialists and said, this is our guy, that really they were ready to accept Hitler and fascism in Germany. In fact, there's a famous incident where apparently there was a leader of the German military who was looking at a Nazi rally. And he said to Schacht, he looked at the flag and he said, there's too much red on their flag, indicating that they saw the Nazis as kind of agitators and radicals. But Hjalmar Schacht reassured the German ruling class that Hitler would not get in their way. He would work for them. He was not a radical. He was not a communist or a radical. He was just somebody who would bring Germany back into order. So when the Nazis came to power, right, they took some very, very swift, dramatic moves. Most especially, you know about the burning of the Reichstag. The Reichstag, the parliament building in Germany, was caught on fire. They used this excuse to declare a state of emergency and to arrest all the members of the Communist Party and have their seats in the parliament filled by Nazis. So the Nazis had like an absolute majority. So they were able to just, push through whatever they wanted at that point, even though they never got a popular vote. Jordan Peterson in his video claims that, that Hitler got the biggest popular vote ever. That's not actually true. Hitler never won the popular vote, but, like historical facts are not Jordan Peterson's best subject. So, but if you look at what they did, right, they immediately set up a network of prison camps, and they put the leaders of the Social Democratic Party and the leaders of the Communist Party in those prison camps, right? So immediately, thousands of people are not looking for a job and competing for jobs with the unemployed. Plus, a number of people got jobs running those concentration camps and building those concentration camps, right? So it was a huge economic stimulus, right? To have a whole bunch of people in prison camps. Plus, they're doing free labor for companies in those prison camps. Companies like Volkswagen and others got free labor, right? And that's a stimulus as well. If companies get this free labor, they don't have to pay anyone to do it. You add to that that they restarted military spending. The Versailles Treaty had forbidden the Nazis from having any military spending. Well, Hjalmar Schacht created a weird quasi-private public corporation to fund military spending. And so they started building tanks and bombs and guns and airplanes. And so that's a whole lot of people getting hired, right? You restart the military spending. Plus, they built these highways, the Autobahns across Germany. And those dramatic moves, those things, if you do all of those things all at once in a really dramatic way, you can have a really big economic boom. And that's how the Nazis were able to stay in power, was because all these people had been starving and rioting and poor. Somebody comes in and then just boom, 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 mass employment, mass stimulus, you win the population's loyalty. And that's how the Nazis were able to set up their totalitarian state, was because they delivered very dramatically by improving the economy. Hitler didn't come to power promising to eradicate the Jews. Hitler came to power promising that he would get every single German person employed. He would have 100% employment. And he did it. He did it by putting half the country in concentration camps and the other half in military uniforms. And there was a lot of ugly killing and destruction and book burning. And it was very, very ugly, but that's how the Nazis were able to stabilize the German economy. What's interesting, and the reason it's worth talking about, in our time, is because after the Second World War, we implemented here in the United States economic stimulus policies that were very similar, but not as dramatic. After the Second World War in the United States, you have the rise of military Keynesianism, where there's huge amounts of money being spent on the military, and people like Dwight Eisenhower and others are basically admitting this isn't really about keeping us safe, this isn't really about fighting the communists. This is about the fact that this is a way to stimulate the U.S. economy and prevent economic crises. And in fact, the reason we don't have trains here in the United States like they do in most European countries is because they borrowed another part of the Nazi platform, and the oil companies bought up the railroads, and then, Dwight Eisenhower built, highways all across the United States, right? Well, build big, giant highways, another big economic stimulus, just like the Autobahns, right? And that military Keynesianism and the spending of money on the military was a way to stimulate the economy. And it's interesting, John Maynard Keynes is very famous. He just advocated the government spending money, right? He talked about ditch digging, right? This is the British economist during the Great Depression. He said that, when capitalism has a crisis, the government needs to spend money. And you can hire somebody to go dig a ditch, and then you can pay somebody else to go dig the ditch back in. And somebody might say that's useless, but hey, those guys all got a wage to do it, and now they're spending money, and this helps resolve any economic problem that you have, right? It's a stimulus. Well, Hjalmar Schacht is on record. The Nazi economist was on record saying that he did not believe in ditch digging. he did not like the idea of hiring people to build things that may not be socially necessary. He was all about military spending. He was all about imprisoning people, but he had this opposition to things like what Roosevelt did with the Works Progress Administration, where they built highways they built schools and hospitals and things like that. Hallemershak didn't particularly care for that. He had kind of an objection to social welfare on the grounds that if you just hire all kinds of people, this encourages the inferior people to breed. And it's the same kind of Malthusian argument. So it's like, we're going to spend money to stimulate the economy, but we're going to spend it on prisons, we're going to spend it on war. That's okay. Spending it on constructive things is dangerous to our society. That kind of mindset, that's really the Nazi economic mindset, is we're going to spend on destruction and repression only. And after, we had our military, and we still have a very military industrial complex economy. In the 1980s, as we're starting to see more economic downturns, we have the rise of the prison industrial complex, a very similar kind of thing, where all of a sudden we have prisons being built everywhere. The incarceration rate in the United States rises through the roof, especially in California, mind you, where Kamala Harris is an up-and-coming star in the prison state. That she's rising up the ranks as a prosecutor, attorney general in San Francisco, and then eventually attorney general of the whole state. And incarceration becomes big business. A number of states start having things like private prisons, where companies get paid for the number of people locked in jail. This is very much, we're using prisons as a way to stimulate the economy. And if you look at what's been going on in the United States, really since the end of the Second World War, we've been gradually implementing elements of Nazi economics, right? In other countries, they stimulate the economy by, hiring the unemployed, by having social welfare programs. We have this weird idea that if you can't do that in the United States, right? That's somehow, it's too kind, that's too nice. So if we're going to stimulate the economy, we're going to have people build bombs. If we're going to stimulate the economy, we're going to build a bunch of prisons. And it has the same kind of mindset and ultimately the same kind of policies. To be fair, though, it's not implemented all at once. When Schacht came in, when the Nazis came in, it was like, boom, they just did it. In the United States, since the end of the Second World War, it's been a gradual process of implementing these kind of Nazi economics, where at this point we have an economy in the United States that depends on prisons and depends on war. If you got rid of the Pentagon, not only would there would be a lot of people out of a job, in the Pentagon itself and in the military, you'd also have a lot of people all throughout the United States that are out of a job. There's still a lot of production that goes on in the United States, right? We all know about offshoring, but when it comes to military hardware, a lot of military hardware is still produced in the United States. It's just not done by workers. It's done by robots, largely. I mean, you don't need assembly line workers to make those tanks and guns anymore. But we have a very much an economy that is based on these kind of Nazi Keynesian, Schachtian economic policies. And I think that has been our downturn. Because if the living standards of the population overall are not rising, if average people are not doing better, you're not really having economic growth. The financial sector, and with their derivatives, they can do well. At the same time, you can have the military-industrial complex doing well. But if average people are not seeing their living standards increase, you're just going to have an economic collapse because their spending is the basis of a good economy. But for some reason, there is this opposition to ever having the government aid average Americans, and that's very disturbing.
Right. Yeah. In your recent interview with Bosch, he defines fascism as the private market being ruled into state authority, which is wrong. But also, he just takes the class collaboration stance, and this is where I think a lot of liberals end up being fascistic. Is they are like, oh well, we don't need to change anything. And they take this radical nothingness stance. I'm not sure what other words to use there, but where do you think they get this definition of fascism, and why is it wrong?
Well, I guess there's a couple ways to come at it, but I think that the main thing is that the left has developed into a group of people that very much fear any popular mobilization or any mobilization of the broad masses of people. Leftism, in a lot of ways, if you look at Susan Sontag's writing, for example, you look at Hannah Arendt, if you look at the work of the Frankfurt School and Adorno, it's all about protecting the intellectuals from the mob, right? And if you ever, if the average people start getting into motion and demanding their rights and wanting the economy to be fixed to make their lives better, that's always bad, whether it calls itself communist or fascist. And that leftism is about protecting the intellectuals from the inferiors who might get in their way and restrict them. And you see that in the writings of George Orwell in particular, and his work was highlighted by the CIA and the Congress for Cultural Freedom program and Partisan Review, and the same with Adorno and Sontag, and that leftism has largely been reinvented to be kind of this middle class longing for freedom and independence. And I think that that's why, because if you look at what leftism is, I mean, go back to the French Revolution, that's where the terms left and right came from. The revolutionaries, the radicals sat on the left, right? And, Karl Marx, he's calling for the working class, the majority, right? Those who sell their labor power to survive, to rise up and take control of the means of production and organize them upon a predetermined plan for the benefit of society so that abundance can be created. This is Marxism. But if you make it just about the intellectual's freedom, right, that's a situation where you could equate any government control over the economy with the Nazis, because the way the Nazis controlled the economy is a very specific way. The way the British Social Democrats have controlled the economy is a very specific way. The way the Soviet Union controlled their economy is a specific way. The way China did. Not all government intervention into the economy is the same. And, every government to some degree or other redistributes wealth, taxes people, stimulates the economy. I mean, there is no free market economy out there, right? I mean, that the state is always somehow involved in managing the economy to some degree or others. The question is, how do they do it, not whether they do it or
not. I was watching the video with him, and I had to pause it, and I just kind of screamed because I run into this issue a lot on the talking to other leftists who especially liberals, especially diehard liberals. They you could I went after Hillary Clinton a lot. I lost a lot of friends, and now all of the stuff that they're assigning fascism to Trumpism, they're letting Joe Biden get away with because he's not Trump. And so to me, they're being fascist. If they are defining fascism as X, Y, and Z, and Joe Biden set the table for X, Y, Z and did X, Y, and Z also, wouldn't that also make him a fascist? No, not according to liberals. Why? What's going on there?
I mean, it's so wild that, it just shows you how much the Democratic Party hates their base. That the main issue people were out in the streets about was mass incarceration in the police state. So who did the Democrats nominate? Joe Biden, Mr. Crime Bill, and Kamala Harris, Miss Prosecutor, lock them up. I mean, they couldn't have done anything more to just tell their base, all the issues you care about, we don't really care about them at all. That's kind of what the Democratic ticket this time.
That's what he said. Yeah.
She's literally the queen of prison labor.
Yeah. Yeah, and I could not think of two candidates who more represent what average Democrats don't like at this time, or during the summer of 2020 when the primary was going on. I can't think of two candidates who more represent what the Democratic base was upset about.
They were both losing. They were losing. Kamala Harris dropped out before the Iowa caucus, and Joe Biden was closing his offices all over the country before the rest of the centrists dropped out and endorsed him. He didn't win a single state. He has run for president 3 times, and he didn't win a single state until after they conspired against Bernie Sanders. But yeah, that's my hot take on that.
Yeah. And then Caleb, you also point out that, Trump is more of a Bonapartist type figure instead of a fascist. So why don't you explain what Bonapartism means?
Sure. Well, there's a very important pamphlet by Karl Marx called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. And it's about, Karl Marx was living in Paris in 1851. And French society at that point was in the middle of a crisis. There were, rebellions and protests and strikes breaking out. The economy was not doing very well. So Louis Bonaparte, who was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, he took power in 1851 in a coup d'etat. The military marched on the government. The elected government was toppled, and Louis Bonaparte became the military dictator. And Karl Marx wrote an entire pamphlet going, basically explaining what in the world is going on. Why is Napoleon's nephew suddenly the military dictator of France? And there were some people who rejoiced and said, okay, this guy is a socialist, he's fighting for the working man. There were other people who didn't support it. And what was going on? Well, if you look at what was going on, French society was in a crisis. The factory workers were hungry and unemployed and starving. The factory capitalists were not selling their products. The farmers were in crisis as well. So it was mainly the financiers, the bankers, selected, Louis Bonaparte to represent them and take power and use the government to try and stabilize the economy. And that's what happens. When capitalism is in crisis, one section of the ruling class or the other will take control of the government and try to use the government to fix the economy. And in France in 1851, Napoleon's nephew, Louis Bonaparte, he called himself Napoleon III, took power, and he enacted, I think it was like a 12-hour workday, for working people. So they only had to work 12 hours in the factory. He built some free hospitals with government money so poor people could go and get medical care. And he built a lot of railroads. Railroads were new technology back then. He built some new railroads. And it had the result of stabilizing things a little bit in the economy. Now, give it a decade, and give it a couple decades, and you have the Paris Commune and all kinds of revolutions. Bonapartist measures only work for a temporary amount of time, but Bonapartism is when one section of the ruling class takes control of the government in the hopes of stabilizing the crisis. And Louis Bonaparte kicked the ass of the factory owners, right? He forced them to accept labor unions in their factories. He forced them to treat their workers better and have 12-hour work days. But he was doing the bidding of the finance capitalists, and he killed a lot of communists and a lot of revolutionaries. So he was trying to stabilize society on behalf of one section of capital. And that you can have all kinds of Bonapartism. Fascism is a form of Bonapartism. Hitler was a right-wing Bonapartist. But I would say Roosevelt was a left-wing Bonapartist, right? He worked with the Rockefellers, but he entered an alliance with labor unions and progressives. And, so you can have different forms of Bonapartism. And when capitalism enters a state of crisis, when there is a crisis in society, what you get is sections of the ruling class will start recruiting working people to kind of be their foot soldiers against other sections of the ruling class. And that's generally what happens in a capitalist crisis, is the capitalists start fighting amongst themselves. Working people are encouraged to be political. Usually working people are kind of pushed out of politics, but in a crisis, they'll start encouraging working people to be political because one section of the ruling class wants to use them to fight another section of the ruling class as the capitalists fight amongst each other, trying to resolve the crisis. And that's what happens. And I think we're facing a Bonapartist crisis in the United States. There's one section of the ruling class, Silicon Valley and the Rockefellers and others that are with the Democrats and Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. And there's another section of the ruling class, namely Betsy DeVos, Secretary of Education under Trump, who's all about military contractors and Blackwater. Home Depot's owner, Bernie Marcus. The owners of Hobby Lobby are big Trump supporters. Peter Thiel, PayPal, he's a big supporter of Trump. And that there are sections of the ruling class that are fighting amongst each other right now. And because they want the government to stabilize the crisis, but not at their expense, right? They want the government to kick the ass of the other guy, not them, right? They don't want to have to pay for the crisis to be resolved. And that's the difference, right? If it's your Bonapartist in there, you get protected while the other capitalists have to pay for it. But if it's the other guy, then you're going to have to pay while the other guy is going to be protected. And that's how Bonapartism tends to work, but it's only a temporary measure. It doesn't resolve the underlying problems, right? The underlying problem is production for profit, is capitalism. And just, having the government try to stabilize it on behalf of one section or another doesn't resolve the underlying problem. However, socialist revolutions, historically, if you look at every socialist revolution, it has emerged from one of these struggles, right? The capitalists are fighting amongst each other, the workers are brought into motion, and out of that crisis of capitalism and a fight among the ruling class, that's where revolutions tend to come, right? They tend to emerge from these kind of squabbles among the ruling class that pretty soon, after workers are brought into motion, the ruling class loses control of them. And so pretty soon, the working class starts having a class for itself perspective and eventually taking power. But that's a long process. But it generally begins with a fight among the capitalists as capitalism enters a crisis.
Yeah, you explained a lot of that way better than I ever could. I have such a hard time, talking to people about fascism. You're right, they don't know anything about Nazi economics. They don't know any, like they lump Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union together. That's such a common thing, and that's like that's not true. That's not true. They assign so much of the atrocities from of Nazi Germany to the Soviet Union, and they're like, oh look, they're both bad, but they couldn't tell you anything besides that.
It's the typical analysis of fascism you get among leftists is fascism is big, scary, mean people being big, scary, and mean. I mean, it's almost like they don't like certain aesthetics. They don't like military uniforms. They don't like, guys standing at the podium and screaming and yelling. All the aesthetics that we associate with fascism historically, they don't like that, right? Because they see it as a threat to their individuality. And that's not a definition. That is very much an idealist definition. It's not something you can concretely point to. It's just a certain kind of emotion that a certain person that's very middle class tends to feel. In times of crisis, working people generally want some kind of strong leader that will resolve the crisis. The question is what kind of leader and what will they do to resolve the crisis? But those who are suffering generally want, some authority to step in and make things right. But it's this middle class layer that has this fear of anyone taking away their little corner of the world, their little individuality. That is the basis of this, this anti-populism that has been a big current in left-wing circles, really since the end of the Second World War and since the CIA started covertly funding it, really.
Yeah, that's to me, that's class collaboration. Am I on the right track there?
Yeah, and it's a middle class deviation, ultimately. In every society around the world, you have a revolutionary intelligentsia. You have younger people, usually they tend to live in urban areas near universities, and they don't like capitalism. They don't like the society they live in. They see it as repressive, and they very much want to see chaos be unleashed, and to see the world made more just. And that current has been all over the capitalist world since the time of the French Revolution. Marx comes out of that current. Che Guevara was in that current. Mao was in that current in China. And you always have it, right? And Marxism historically comes out of that current. So does fascism, interestingly. But that's another the Mussolini and Hitler were all in that current as well. But that's where you got smart political people in capitalist societies. But the way that countries have actually had revolutions is when people from that milieu have the brilliance to start mobilizing the broad masses of people, right? And that's where socialism comes from. And I think what we saw during the Cold War was that with a lot of money being funneled into artists and academics and people in this revolutionary intelligentsia milieu, you saw some of the more negative qualities of that milieu become exaggerated. And really the kind of anti-popular sentiments, the radical individualism, the desire for chaos that always kind of existed among that milieu got very, very exaggerated. Whereas the wisdom and knowledge that came out of the Russian Revolution and Bolshevism, this understanding that we have to be disciplined, we have to get to the broad masses of people, we have to build a united front, we have to raise transitional demands, that all got obscured, right? And that is really the problem, is that the problematic tendencies of the revolutionary intelligentsia, they kind of got greatly exaggerated as part of a covert effort with the Congress for Cultural Freedom program of the CIA and other things, as part of a conscious effort to weaken the influence of communists among intellectuals.
Yeah, so let's stick with this trend here. I think it's very fair to say that we've been seeing a rise in popularity in race essentialism, postmodernism, privilege and decolonization discourse. For example, Jay Sakai's book, Settlers, is a very popular reference point for those who claim to be Marxists, even though the book is very much anti-Marxist and it's totally void of class analysis. Talk about what the synthetic left is and how it was created, and why does it benefit the capitalist ruling class, and how do we counter it?
Well, after the Second World War, you had a period called McCarthyism in U.S. history, where the Communist Party, their leaders were all put in prison. The FBI just went after the communists, and witch hunts in Hollywood and all of that. But McCarthyism caused some problems, namely because it became a vehicle for attacking some of the wealthiest people, right? Joe McCarthy said the U.S. Army was communist. Lester Hunt, who was a member of Congress, actually committed suicide because Joe McCarthy had blackmailed him. And that McCarthyism was so out of control, it was actually harming the interests of American capitalism. The USA wanted to use Yugoslavia as an ally against the Soviet Union, right? It was a communist country that had cut ties with the Soviets. Tito and Stalin didn't get along, but the US couldn't do that because, oh no, we hate all communists, and McCarthyism was a big problem. It became so extreme and crazy, it made things very difficult in waging the Cold War. And so based on that, you had kind of an effort to kind of move in the other direction. The feeling was that rather than combating the communists by having the most extreme, anti-communism and militarism and authoritarianism in the United States, what we're going to do is we're going to open up, and we're going to be liberal and open-minded. And some of that liberal and open-mindedness will spread into the socialist countries and eventually create unrest and overthrow them. And that's what the CIA intended to do when they set up the Congress for Cultural Freedom programs. Zbigniew Brzezinski and others really kind of escalated this strategy after the U.S. defeat in Vietnam. And that was the strategy, was rather than, fighting the communists head on, right? Rather than defeating their ideology with our ideology, we're going to say that there is no truth. We're going to say that everything's just a matter of opinion, right? And we're going to create an atmosphere of deconstruction, right? And that was the strategy. And it was done primarily at first to just weaken the influence of Marxism and communism among intellectuals and artists and activists. And all kinds of CIA money was given to like Trotskyites and anarchists and others to just kind of, promote the sections of the left that were not communist. But then it started to take on another character, and you have, the color revolutions and the eventual toppling of the Soviet Union. That's the synthetic left. Now, as far as Jay Sakai, that book Settlers has been around a long time. It's not a new book. I believe it was published in the 1980s, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, and
right, 1980, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I first read that book as a high school student. And I was a high school student during the Bush years, 2004, 2005, and I read that book. And at the time, I loved it. I thought it was great. And why? Because I was living in a small town in Ohio. It was a working class town. Most of the people in my town worked at a factory that made jelly. Some other people worked at a dairy plant that processed milk and dairy products. Other people worked at a company that made parts of machines that made auto parts, and that this was a very working class town I grew up in. And they had labor unions in the factories. It was the Teamsters Union. I did some job shadowing with the local Teamster organizer at one point as a high school student. These folks were all very, very working class, factory workers, but they all supported the Iraq War, almost all of them, with few exceptions. They supported the Iraq War. If you didn't support the Iraq War, you were a traitor. You needed to move to another country. Islam was an evil religion that needed to be outlawed because they're all terrorists. A lot of evangelical Christianity, wanting to ban gay marriage and just a lot of right-wing stuff among these people that were factory workers. Well, that was what Lenin called the aristocracy of labor, that these folks, they were living in the first world and they had a high standard of living, right? And because of that, they sympathized with American imperialism, right? Because the imperialists had provided them with a living standard that was way higher than most of the people in the world. And Lenin talked about that very phenomenon in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. He says that as the imperialist countries dominate the globe, they buy off a section of the working class. And after World War II, the post-war boom in the United States, that white picket fence and that car, that came with a really right-wing shift among American industrial workers because they were loyal to empire because they were getting a few crumbs from it. That's a real phenomenon. The problem with that book, though, is that book says that reality, that labor aristocracy reality, is permanent, right? Yeah. There can never be a socialist revolution in the United States because there's a big labor aristocracy. Well, anyone who's been paying attention to U.S. politics and U.S. economy for the last 20, 30, 40 years has seen that labor aristocracy has been in decline and decline and decline. You go to the town that I grew up in, those factories are closed. I mean, people have lost their jobs. People are dying from opioids. People have relatives who are in prison. People are hungry. Most of the people in my town have moved to other places in order to work. I live in New York City now. A lot of people have moved to California. I mean, the Midwest, the labor aristocracy of the Midwest is being demolished right now, right? Furthermore, race is a big factor. I mean, the labor aristocracy is white, right? And my town, and like many other towns throughout the Midwest, is more integrated than ever before. There are more Latino students at the high school I went to than there ever were when I was there. There are more students of Indian heritage. There are more Black families so the race aspect, the racism that made the labor aristocracy so right-wing, race was a big deal, right? That's not there either. So this notion that the white working class of the United States, they're this bought-off labor aristocracy, they can never be revolutionary, that was probably true in the 1950s, definitely true in the 1980s. It's not true anymore. Right now, the labor aristocracy is in so much decline that Bernie Sanders, an open socialist, is more popular than ever, right? More popular than ever. Furthermore, among white youth, there's a huge amount of sympathy for Black Lives Matter and opposition to the police state and opposition to the war on drugs. Right now, we're living in a period where this labor aristocracy that stabilized US society and prevented progressive political action is being broken apart, and the potential for solidarity against racism, solidarity against imperialist wars, solidarity against the police state is bigger than ever before. So to be talking about Jay Sakai right now and to just hold that book up is exactly wrong. It is the wrong thing to do in our time. I sympathize with how people might feel, but I feel like in a lot of cases, people who wave around Jay Sakai, it's an excuse to justify their own paralysis. They're frustrated. They're around a lot of very conservative people. They can see through all the anti-communist lies. Other people can't. They're frustrated. They're feeling isolated. They feel like no one understands them. They feel alienated from society. So they can point to that book and say, see, you all are a bunch of rotten Euro settlers, screw you. And they don't have to do the hard work, the very, very hard work of changing people's consciousness. And that's the problem with that book that I would have. It points to a lot of very true things, right? But the true things it points to doesn't add up to what they say it adds up to, right? The world is constantly changing. The world is constantly in motion. And as the world is constantly changing, things that used to be impossible become possible, right? And we are in a period where the revolutionary potential of all the workers in the United States is rising. It's not declining. So now is the wrong time to be screaming about labor aristocracy, in my view.
I do have another question for you about another book. I saw you got the opportunity to meet Alexander Dugin. I have a copy of The Fourth Political Theory, and his analysis on like liberalism is just so great. I don't talk to many people who like have read this book or even know who he is. And if they know who he is, they're like, oh, you're a Duginist, or you tanky, or like stuff like that, so it's like never anything. What would Dugin have to say about that? About like the potential for a socialist revolution to happen in the United States, because he argues that like communism and fascism are dead, right? And so he's like, we need a fourth way, right? So I'm one, because that's one of the videos of yours I watched recently. So I wondered your thoughts on that as well.
Well, Dugin is not a Marxist. He's not a socialist. He's not a communist. And he has actually said in a number of his writings that he has no position on American politics other than he wants, he supports maybe isolationists, right-wing isolationists, because he wants them to leave Russia alone. And, Dugin's political movement in Russia is called the Eurasian movement. And Dugin really believes that there are two forms of civilization in the world. There is Atlanticist civilization, which is from societies that are based, have a lot of access to the ocean. And there is Eurasian civilization, and that's societies that are more landlocked. And he argues that Eurasian civilizations are more collective, and that Atlanticist civilizations are more individualist. There's some truth in that. I mean, it's not entirely correct, but there's some truth in that. Dugin was a communist at one point. He was a founding member of the Russian Communist Party, an associate of Zhuganov, and he wrote the constitution of the Russian Communist Party. Then in the 1990s, he formed something called the National Bolshevik Party, and he eventually dropped out of that. And now he runs something called the Eurasian Movement. He's very much a conservative. He argues that there are some inherent traditional ways, and that especially in Eurasia and in Russia, they have kind of a natural way of being. He draws a lot from Julius Evola. And, you know, he's right-wing, but he's against Western capitalism. He is a conservative intellectual in Russia. And that book, The Fourth Political Theory, is interesting because it points to a lot of truths, right? I read that book after having gone to Iran, after having gone to Venezuela, and realizing that this was not like Cold War communism, right? That the opposition to American imperialism around the world, in Iran, in Venezuela, other forces, what's rising in China now, it has elements of things we might call left, and it has elements of things that we might call right? The fact that in China right now, there's a huge revival of communism. You know, Mao pictures are everywhere. People are quoting Mao more than they have since like the Cultural Revolution. But at the same time, there's also a huge revival of Confucian thought, right? In the traditional Confucian thought, right? Mao hated Confucius, right? Mao saw Confucius as Chinese feudalism. He, you know, destroyed all the Confucius books. Well, now in modern China, Mao and Confucius walk hand in hand because they're both seen as elements of China's unique identity that makes it separate from the West, right? Confucius is considered right-wing and traditional. Mao is a Marxist revolutionary, but they both have elements of this non-liberalism that kind of defines modern China. And I think that that's what Dugin, he's not even advocating it really. He just points to it in that book. And that's why I learned a lot from that book. And that's why I did praise Dugin when I met with him. I've only met him one time. And honestly, I mean, one of Dugin's main points is he rejects the notion of historical progress. He says that the past, the present, and the future are equal, and that the world is not getting better, it's not getting worse, and that is just entirely wrong in my view. I am a futurist. I believe that humanity is a progressive species that marches forward. I am an optimist, so my worldview is pretty different than Dugin's, but I respect him. Right? And I don't think it is accurate to equate Dugin with Adolf Hitler, right? People say, well, they've got a picture of Dugin shaking hands with somebody. Okay, Dugin is Dugin, all right? Dugin, he has his own strand of thought. If people want to know what Dugin thinks, go and read Dugin. I'm not a Duginist. I don't represent Alexander Dugin, and I don't agree with him on a number of points, but I respect him as an intellectual, and I don't think, you'll notice that if you look at any of the like Wikipedia articles about Dugin in the English language, the first sentence will say Dugin is a fascist. But if you read The Fourth Political Theory, he denounces fascism in that book. Very
page one, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think that my suspicion is that because, you know, he has been an advisor to Putin, he had a TV network in Russia at one point called Tsargrad TV. And I get the idea that American intelligence has decided that Dugin is the worst Russian, right? He's on the sanctions list, and I think that because of that, they have done everything they can to create a stigma around Alexander Dugin, you know, to make it sound like he is the Russian Hitler or something like that. He's not. He's just Dugin, right? He's Dugin. He's a conservative Russian intellectual. He has a lot of influence. He has a lot of people in Russia who listen to him. There's a lot of people in Russia who don't agree with him, right? Well, and he doesn't represent all of the Putin movement. I think there are Putin supporters who like Dugin. There are Putin supporters who vehemently disagree with Dugin. He's an important Russian thinker and intellectual. And I'm not ashamed of the fact that I sat down with him. And I find it to be absurd that people, they hold up a picture and they say, oh, see, you're a Nazi. I'm not a Nazi, okay? I've spent years as an anti-racist activist, look into my history. I'm very clearly not on the right, but I don't think that Dugin is Satan incarnate. I think he's an important figure. And I had the opportunity to sit down with him at a conference in Moscow in 2018. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
I was really impressed actually because I have a couple friends who live in Russia and Poland, and they really like Dugin, but one of my friends is like a devout Marxist, and the other person I know, the other friend of mine, he's like really into Evola and stuff like that, and they both have like such different takeaways from what Dugin has to say. And I don't know, thank you for sharing your thoughts on that, because it's a really polarizing topic that I don't get to.
I mean, people should think for themselves. I don't like it. I mean, the people who will attack me over Dugin are people who heard of Dugin 2 seconds before they attacked me over him as a reason.
Right.
I mean, I wish people could think for themselves. I wish people were intellectually curious, right? Mao Zedong, he said, you don't really know what a pear is like until you bit into it. And I think that applies to Dugin as well. Read what Dugin has to say, make a decision for yourself. And that's what I've done. I just gave you my analysis of Dugin. I respect him, but I also don't agree with him. And that's that. I mean, that's all there is to it.
Right. And I don't want to spend so much time on this subtler book, but I'm currently still going through the book, but I've come across some issues with it that I've found. There's lots of uncited sources, and other people that have read this book more than once have critiqued it and found really egregious issues with it, like the misquoting of William Z. Foster, which I think is really egregious. But I think this whole trend of like this Jay Sakai, like settlers, is like, is like this sacred cow, like it can't be critiqued, otherwise you're you're a chauvinist and a racist if you are, critiquing it. I think it follows this trend that we've been seeing with this synthetic left, very defeatist. It's very negative, and it's all about division, and it's about solidarity. And I think that's why it's such a popular book among the so-called left.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, but it fits kind of that anti-populist worldview, right? All the white working people of the United States are all a bunch of Euro settlers. They're all the enemy. So don't try to organize them. Don't try to win a better life for them.
The third worldist type deal.
Yeah,
and no one's seen this guy. Like there's no picture of him anywhere. It's like so weird. It's so weird. Like these people are like, the people that are really like stuck on the book and just really just praise it are, I'm just like, it's just so odd to me that this guy has like never, it's like he's maybe done one or two interviews that are all audio. I've never seen a picture of him. I think it's very strange. This guy just comes out of nowhere, has this book, and everyone, it's like, it's all over the place and no one's seen him.
Yeah, how did it even resurface? Like I had never even heard of
it until like,
and now I can't like go any of my like lefty groups on Facebook. It's in every group now. Like how did that happen?
When I first heard of it, it was at the time I was in Ohio. I was working with some prisoners in Ohio. There were a group of prisoners who were involved in the Lucasville prison uprising in 1993, and they were, some of them were facing the death penalty and all of that. And I was involved in the Lucasville Prisoner Support Committee. And I would visit prisoners and go to their court dates and such. And a lot of them had a newspaper from an obscure, very mysterious communist group called the Maoist Internationalist Movement, MIM. And it was a newspaper, it was called MIM Notes. And it was a strange newspaper. And a lot of prisoners told me that they were very suspicious of this newspaper that would start showing up. If prisoners were known to be communists, they would start getting MIM Notes, sent to them in the mail. And they would have no idea who was sending. And it was this very mysterious paper that was sent mainly to Black prisoners in Ohio and throughout the country. If you were getting, Workers' World or the Revolution newspaper, or Revolutionary Worker, you would also start to get this newspaper called MIM Notes. It was very mysterious, and it was a communist group that was very, very shadowy and shady, and no one really knows who they were. But they pushed that book, and that if you were a prisoner and you would send them a letter to their P.O. box, they would send you a photocopied edition of Settlers in the mail. And prisoners showed it to me. They had this book, Settlers, The Mythology of the White Proletariat, and it was like a spiral-bound photocopied edition of the book that they had in the prisons. It was very mysterious, very, very mysterious. I do know that it was revealed that the leader of this MIM group was a guy named Henry Park, who had lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan for a while, and had gone to China a few times and died. And there was an obituary when he died. He was a Korean American. He'd been friendly to the RCP, and he claimed that they had accused him of rape or something like that. And it's the more you look into that rabbit hole, the whole thing is just really, really, really weird. But that's kind of how American leftism is. It's all.
RCP.
What's that?
the Revolutionary Communist Party with the Avakian people, right? That's
Henry Park wrote a statement before his death, dissolving his organization called the Maoist Internationalist Movement. And in his statement, he claimed that the reason he was dissolving the group was that the Revolutionary Communist Party was accusing him of rape from decades ago, and that it wasn't true. And that was bizarre, because if you ask anyone from the RCP, they don't know anything about this. The whole thing is really strange. And, you know, we do know there was this individual, this Korean-American man, Henry Park, and he had been at Harvard, and he'd had an organization called Radicads, which stood for Radical Academics, and they organized trips to China during the Gang of Four period, and they were kind of around the RCP and had a falling out. And he apparently was the individual who put out this mysterious newspaper, and he was the one who really popularized Jay Sakai's book Settlers. And he made it like his mission to popularize that book on the internet. And he had the third worldist line that white workers are inherently reactionary. It was a very strange grouping. Yeah, and they apparently dissolved. I mean, it was around, you know, around like the early 2000s, they were still doing stuff. And, you know, occasionally I would be at a university and I would see a stack of their newspapers, NIM notes, newspapers someplace. But who knows who they were, right? And I mean, you never know with any of this stuff, right? I mean, you never really know with any of it, right? When we know that, you know, the government, you know, it's been proven that there have been instances where the government set up fake communist organizations, but we also know that the government also infiltrates actual communist groups and pushes them to do different things. And you know, I mean, the United States during the Cold War was the homeland of anti-communism, right? This was the home of the free world. So, you know, I mean, the US government goes all over the world preventing communist revolutions. So you think anyone here talking about a communist revolution, they are going to be right on top of you. You know, so, you know, the left has been, and this is kind of an example of why things are so weird. Leftism in the United States has been so manipulated, right? And there have been so many covert efforts to maneuver and all of that. There's actually a very good book written by a British intelligence officer named Frank Kitson. And he wrote a memoir. It's called Gangs and Counter-Gangs. Oh. And it was about how Kenya, during the Mau Mau uprising, when the Land and Freedom Army was formed in the 1950s in Kenya, right? The people of Kenya were fighting for their freedom. So the British intelligence, they realized they had a little bit of a problem, because to fight the Mau Mau, all the British soldiers were white, right? And the Kenyans were black. And so it was a bit of a problem. They would go into an area to fight the Mau Mau, and all the black people would support the Mau Mau. So they got the idea to, you know, get some black people and say, okay, well, you're now the Kenyan Liberation Army. And, you know, and you hate the British, you hate the British Empire, but you really hate those Mau Mau, don't you, right? Those Mau Mau are like the phonies, and you're going to go wage a war against the Mau Mau for not being true anti-British revolutionaries. And it worked, right? It was part of the way the British were able to do it. And they set up what they called a counter gang, right? And this is a tactic used in low-intensity warfare. Actually, William S. Lind, who was a Pentagon advisor, he talks about fourth generation warfare, and he makes similar arguments. He talks about how in Northern Ireland, the British realized that the British government fighting the IRA wasn't so great. So they started arming Protestant groups like the Orange Order and Ulster separatists to fight them, right? And that having, you know, the Ulster Unionists, they could murder somebody extrajudicially, and that wasn't a war crime, right? Because it's a terrorist group killing another terrorist group, right? And that by setting up a counter gang, that can be an effective way to fight. And these are the kind of tactics that are used in insurgencies, in low intensity warfare, and in counterintelligence operations. And I mean, for example, I mean, the Spartacist League just dissolved, right? This was a communist group that was around. They're no longer around. They've officially dissolved, right? So I can talk shit about them because they don't exist anymore. You know, during the 1980s, the Workers' World Party had a very effective demonstration called the People's Anti-War Mobilization, where they organized 100,000 people to march to the Pentagon against Ronald Reagan, you know, in 1981. The Spartacist League mobilized their members to attack that march with baseball bats. And the justification that they gave was the march called for peace in Nicaragua, peace in El Salvador. And so they said, by calling for peace, this is a march against the armed communist guerrilla insurgencies in those countries. That was a lie, right? I mean, the march was an anti-imperialist march, but they told their members there's a peace march on Washington led by the Workers' World Party. That means they don't support the armed communist guerrillas of Nicaragua and all of that. So they got their members and they showed up in leather jackets with baseball bats and they charged the People's Anti-War Mobilization and injured a lot of people, right? Now, what was going on there? Well, what inspires some weird Trotskyist group to take up weapons against a big communist-led anti-war rally? Who knows, right? Now, what's also interesting is the Moonies, the Unification Church, prior to that, went through Washington, D.C., ripping down all the posters, right? And that it appears that because the People's Anti-War Mobilization was a pro-Soviet, pro-China, anti-imperialist rally that got hundreds of thousands of people to attend it as a march against Reagan and the war drive, it appears that U.S. intelligence mobilized their allies to disrupt it in some ways. And we had the Moonies that are long time known to be CIA assets. They went after it, and it appears the Spartacist League was probably infiltrated, and they targeted it with violence as well. And this kind of thing happens, and that's why stuff like MIM, stuff like that, you don't want to snitch jacket. You never want to point at anyone and say you're a provocateur and you're an informer, and that's not the point. The point isn't, are you working for the government or not? The point is what you're doing helping the working class struggle or not? That's the point. And Jay Sakai, not helping, right? Spartacists attacking the People's Anti-War Mobilization with baseball bats, not helping. When you see people that are kind of not helping, that's what needs to be called out, right? What their motivation is, who might be manipulating them in order to do it, that's a whole nother conversation. And if you spend too much time thinking about that, you're going to lose your mind and become paranoid, right? It's
suspicious of everybody. Yeah. A lot of what you're saying reminds me a lot of the stuff I see happening like in the Middle East, with like all these terrorist groups getting U.S. weapons somehow. You have to really wonder how they're getting, Saudi Arabia funneling all these terror groups weapons that we give them. It's
well, in Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, the Grand Chessboard, which is about how to dominate Eurasia, he said that the goal is to, quote, keep the barbarians killing each other. And that is the goal for maintaining U.S. hegemony. Keep the barbarians killing each other. Yeah.
That's disgusting.
Yeah.
What was that?
It's called the Grand Chessboard. The Iraq War, the Iraq-Iran War, was a great example of two anti-imperialist states, right? Ba'athist Arab socialism in Iraq, Islamic Revolutionary, the Islamic Republic in Iran, killing each other. Right? And the USA gave covert support to both sides. It gave weapons to Iran at some points, and it gave weapons to Iraq at some points. And at least 1 million people died as two anti-imperialist forces were manipulated against each other. And I think that, that's a tactic that can be used. And that this is the late Cold War. See, when the Cold War started, it was American imperialism versus the communists. And that tended to strengthen the communists, right? But Brzezinski's whole thing is let's manipulate communists against each other. Right? Let's have the USA look like it's retreating and then just incite the communists to kill each other. And that's how the Cold War was won, really, for the United States.
Mm-hmm.
The Sino-Soviet split, the Euro-communist divide, where the communists of Europe turned against the Soviet Union, all throughout the 1980s, all kinds of Eastern European governments turning their backs on the Soviets and then getting in debt to American banks. This was all a strategy for how to defeat communism and how to defeat the Soviet Union by playing communists against each other.